We are coming up on Halloween here in Michigan, and winter is definitely approaching. Our low temperatures are down in the 30s at night, and we've had snow flurries. I am maybe 2 weeks away from the start of the Persephone period when my day length drops less than 10 hours. So naturally, my response to this has been planning next year's garden. If you've seen the other videos in this series, you know that I'm planning a few different food production systems on this property. But today I'm going to focus on the fenced garden area that will be behind me, where I'm going to grow most of my annual crops. I'm going to talk through the rotations and the timing. In particular, I'm doing something a little different with this property. I'm planning to rely more on overwintering in order to get an early spring harvest. I used SketchUp to create a three-dimensional view of the site. This is looking from the south. Here, I've zoomed in on the fenced-in garden area. You can see the enclosing fence, raised beds, trellises across the walkways, and the chicken coop along the north edge. I'll talk about the perennial crops in a later video. For now, I'll note that several of those will be in the raised beds along the north and west wall. For today, I'm going to focus on the plan for annual crops. These will be in the 12 raised beds in the southeast part of the garden. Each of the beds are 4 feet by 8 feet to efficiently use standard lumber, and I'm going to make them quite tall, about 3 feet. This is all going to admittedly be more expensive to build, but one of my themes as we've designed this whole site, including the house, has been mobility and ease of use. This is partly due to the fact that, as I have shared, I do have MS and consequently a higher chance of future mobility issues. But honestly, it's mostly just driven by the fact that we never want to move again. We're trying to age in place on this property. Having taller beds and wider walkways helps to protect for that. Quick overview on what I am growing. I have 18 different annual crops in these beds. About 2/3 of those are cool weather crops for the spring, fall, and winter growing, and about 1/3 are my summer crops. I'll cover the long season beds in a later video. For now, I'll just note that I'm using them to grow 6 different crops, mostly root vegetables, that simply take too long to grow to fit into my annual crop rotation. Let's talk about rotation and bed types. You might remember I have 2 basic types of beds in my plan. One's where I grow spring and fall crops, and others where I grow summer and then winter crops. I did a whole video on this earlier, but the basic idea is that one year a bed grows summer and winter crops, and then the next year it switches types and it becomes a spring/fall bed. Since I grow different plant families in the 2 bed types, it was a decent way to ensure some rotation in the beds, and I think that's sufficient for a home gardening scale. Overall, I still recommend this approach for anybody that wants a simple crop rotation on their property for home gardening purposes. The change I am making next year is that I want to overwinter to allow for early spring harvests. Our springs here are super unpredictable in terms of temperature swings and precipitation, and it can be really hard to get things to germinate and grow. Fall is a much safer bet for me. If I can start things right around September and get them to grow a few inches tall before the Persephone period hits, I can then let them stay in the ground over the winter and get an earlier and larger spring harvest. Half of the garden will follow the former simple rotation with spring/fall beds and summer/winter beds. But I'm now adding a distinction between early spring beds and late spring beds. The early spring beds are planted the fall before. Note that both of those types then get underplanted with buckwheat and get the same crops in the fall. This approach results in one more change because half of my spring beds are now getting planted the fall before. They are effectively occupied for the winter. This means that of my 6 summer beds, only half of them, or 3, can be used to grow winter crops, and the others are going to get pre-planted for the next year's spring harvest. I've marked those here and I'm calling them summer-only beds to distinguish from the other summer/winter beds. This will mean lower yields in the winter since I'm only growing winter crops in half of them, but that's a time of year when I have limited choices anyway, and really there's only so much kale you can eat. I'd rather can and preserve things through the rest of the year for winter consumption and focus these beds on getting a better harvest in the spring when I'm seriously craving some fresh produce. Let me talk about our trellises for a second and how they fit in. I am once again using 8-foot cattle panel sections. They're going to be arched between the edges of the beds, just like in our last house, and they're going to span across the walkways, just like in our last house, but I'm applying them a little bit differently and using them on the short ends of the bed. Here's a closer view of those trellises. I will use these trellises to grow dried beans each year. This gives a crop yield for us, but maybe more importantly, they fix atmospheric nitrogen and they make it available to other plants for an extra boost of free fertilizer in the beds. The trellises are at the ends, and that means the beans can be planted in summer and be out of the way regardless of what type of bed it is. All right, let's talk about what goes in each bed. I have created scaled drawings of each bed type. I have listed out the quantities of what I'm growing in each bed, both per bed and then the total across the 3 or 6 beds that we are talking about, depending on the plant type. This is the drawing of the early spring bed. Come summer, when these beds are planted out to buckwheat, there will also be dried beans on both ends, and I've noted those here. I picked spring varieties that are recommended for overwintering in this bed, such as aquadulce fava beans, purple sprouting broccoli, Alsmere cauliflower, Chantenay carrots, and giant winter or Thais spinach. These are all planted the fall before. I've also included radishes in this bed. They would be sown in the spring under the edges of the then still small fava beans. Radishes grow quickly, and I count them as another early spring harvest, even though they're not being planted the fall before. You'll notice I'm growing quite a few radishes. This is because I like to roast them like potatoes and use them in place of them. I'm also growing quite a bit of spinach. This is because I like to chop that, blanch, and freeze it, and then use it later for soups or smoothies. Couple of quick notes specifically on the logic of the layout in this bed. The bed will have a domed cover over it for warmth, and with that in mind, I have placed the tallest crops in the center. The fava beans fix nitrogen and are planted adjacent to the heavy-feeding brassicas to give them a boost. And looking at the carrots, when those resume growth in the spring, they're going to start casting some shade over the spinach next to them to the north, and that's helpful to delay bolting of the spinach. Moving to my late spring bed, this will also have a domed cover for both warmth as well as cabbage moth protection when those buggers start kicking in the spring. The arugula and lettuce are prone to bolting as temperatures increase, and I've tucked those in between the chard and the brassicas down the middle. Initially, the arugula and the lettuce will get full sun, but as the season progresses and the other plants get larger, they'll start to get some shade right when temperatures rise. You can see the dried beans along the short edges arching across the walkways, and again, they'll be out of the way, but I am including them in the count of things grown in this bed. All 6 of the spring beds, both the early and the late type, get the same things planted in them, a buckwheat cover crop followed by the same fall plantings. Let me show you that. Looking at the fall bed layout, many of these crops are going to be still planted in the summer, and as such, they're going to need cabbage moth protection, and I'm going to bring back those domed covers and put tall crops down the middle with shorter elements at the edges. You'll notice I've focused on salad greens and brassicas in these beds. These do better in the fall with less tendency to bolt, and I like to put them in the fall beds as much as possible. Moving on to the summer/winter beds, all 6 of those, kind of like in the fall, all 6 of these get the same thing planted in them to start in the summer. For the summer beds, I will use a straight trellis down the middle, probably with nylon netting, that can be accessed from the long edges with nothing more than a 2-foot reach to get to the middle, and I'm going to use that to grow my tomatoes, roughly 5 per bed. The south side of the trellis, which for me in the northern hemisphere is the sunny side, has soybeans and peppers as well as 1 summer squash plant. In the summer, the sun is high overhead, so it's not as if the north side of the trellis is especially shady, but to be safe, that's where I've put things that need less sun, such as heat-tolerant greens like chard and beet greens, as well as 1 more squash plant. Since these summer crops are mostly fruiting crops that require pollination, I will interplant some borage and holy basil to attract pollinators. As an added bonus, the holy basil can also confuse squash pest insects with its strong scent. Turning to the winter beds, only 3 beds will be used to grow winter crops. They will go in right around August, and the goal here is to get them in the ground, underplant them as the remaining summer crops are still there. I'm trying to grow these all the way to maturity before the start of my Persephone period. For me, that is mid-November. On these beds, I will add a sloped cold frame lid for extra cold protection once our frosts get going in October, and consequently, I have placed my taller crops along the north edge of this bed rather than down the middle. I'm also going to place some bricks or small jugs of water along that edge to act as thermal mass. The shorter crops are along the south edge and include mustards along with some cold hardy varieties of both spinach and lettuce that I've been wanting to try, like Marvel of 4 Seasons. Last but not least, I wanted to show you what the summer-only beds look like as we go into winter. They were pre-planted for the spring. I won't put those in until probably September since I am not trying to grow them to maturity. The goal is just to have them be a few inches tall before the Persephone period kicks in. They will resume growth the following spring and start filling out, but you can tell and from this drawing, they look pretty sad and tiny at the end of winter. I may layer extra leaves and other elements around them to help give them even further thermal protection and insulation as the cold of the winter progresses. In case anybody is curious, I did summarize here the total amounts of annual crops that I'm growing across all of my beds throughout the year. I will do the same for the perennial and long season crops when I post those videos. There it is, my admittedly ambitious garden plan for next year. If you have any questions, please post them and I'll do my best to respond. Overall, I hope it was helpful. And if there are any areas that I didn't touch on that you think I should when I start creating the videos for the long season bed that's going to be up in the northwest corner or the perennial details, let me know and I will incorporate those into the next couple of videos that we post. Otherwise, I hope you guys had a really good growing season and that this is all helpful as you start doing your layouts for next year. Until next time, thanks.